Lock that door, Olivia. Her neighbor's voice was still ringing in her ears from 2 hours ago. You see leather jackets and patches on a night like this. You lock that door, turn off the lights, and you pray they keep riding. Olivia Whitmore stood at the window of her father's diner, her breath fogging the glass, watching 59 motorcycles roll to a stop in her parking lot through the worst blizzard Red Valley, Montana had seen in 11 years. Her 6-year-old daughter was asleep in the back room. The register had $43 in it, and every single person in this town would tell her she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. Then one of the riders fell. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And when you're done watching, drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Olivia. The wind hit the diner windows like something alive that night, like it had a grudge, like it had been building itself up out on the open highway for 100 miles, just to unload everything it had on that one small building at the edge of Red Valley. The diner was called Whitmore's, the same name it had carried for 31 years since Olivia's father, Roy Whitmore, had built it himself with 3 friends in a borrowed truck and a stubbornness that his daughter had apparently inherited in full. Roy had been dead for 14 months. Olivia had been trying to keep his diner alive for every single one of those months, and she was losing. She wasn't dramatic about it. That wasn't her style. She didn't sit around crying into her coffee or telling her troubles to every customer who walked through the door. She just worked. She opened at 5:30 in the morning and she closed whenever the last customer left. And in between, she cooked and served and cleaned and fixed whatever broke, which was always something. And when her daughter Gracie woke up scared in the middle of the night, Olivia was there for that too. She was always there. She didn't have a choice. There was nobody else. Her husband, Danny, had made sure of that. Danny Whitmore. She still used his last name, mostly because changing it felt like one more thing she didn't have the energy for had left on a Tuesday morning 16 months ago. He didn't leave a note. He left a duffel bag of clothes missing from the closet, a truck that wasn't in the driveway, and a stack of bills on the kitchen counter that Olivia hadn't known existed. Credit cards, a second mortgage on the diner property that her father had left her free and clear. A loan from a private lender whose letterhead had no physical address on it, just a P.O. box in Billings, and a number with a late fee schedule that made Olivia's vision go strange the first time she read it. She'd sat at that kitchen counter for 2 hours with Gracie on her hip, reading those papers over and over, trying to make them say something different. They never did. "Mama," Gracie had said, pressing her small palm against Olivia's cheek. "Are you sad?" "No, baby," Olivia had said. "I'm thinking." "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about what we're going to do next." What she did next was call the bank, then the county, then a lawyer who charged $200 for a 30-minute consultation and told her that the second mortgage was legal, the loan was binding, and her options were limited. She thanked him, paid him, drove to the diner, put on an apron, and started a pot of coffee. That had been 16 months ago. Since then, she'd kept the doors open through sheer force of will and very little else. She'd let the dining room heater run on its lowest setting to save propane, which meant customers sometimes kept their coats on. She'd switched her menu to a shorter list of items she could source cheaply and cook fast. She'd stopped hiring help, which meant she was doing everything alone. She'd pushed every payment she could to the last possible day. And she'd sold her own car and started borrowing her neighbor Linda's truck on the mornings Linda didn't need it. The bank's most recent letter was pinned to the corkboard behind the counter under a magnet shaped like a trout that her father had bought at a gas station in Wyoming. The letter used phrases like final notice, an initiation of foreclosure proceedings, and 60-day response window, which Olivia had now reduced to 11 days. 11 days. She looked at that letter every morning when she came in and every night when she turned off the lights. She looked at it the way you look at something you're determined not to let beat you even when the math says it already has. That was the state of Olivia Whitmore's world on the night the storm came. She'd been about to close. It was 9:47 by the clock above the pie case, a clock her father had hung there in 1993, and that still kept perfect time. And the last customer, a trucker named Dennis, who came through twice a month and always ordered the same thing, had left 20 minutes ago. Olivia had already wiped down the counter and put the chairs up on most of the tables. She was running the last load of dishes and thinking about Gracie, who'd fallen asleep on the cot in the back room around 8, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been washed so many times its ears had gone flat. She was thinking she'd carry Gracie to the truck and get home before the storm got worse. Then she heard them. She heard them before she saw them. The sound came from far down the highway, a low rumble that she felt more than heard at first, something that made the dishes rattle faintly in the drying rack and made her stop what she was doing and stand still listening. Then it got louder and louder, and she walked to the window, and through the snow that was coming down thick and sideways she saw headlights. Not one pair, not two, dozens, a long broken line of them stretching back into the dark. Her first thought was a highway emergency and accident, a pile-up something official. Her second thought when the headlights got close enough that she could see they were all motorcycles was something else entirely. She knew the patch before she could read the words. Everybody in towns along this stretch of highway knew it. 3 colors, black, gold, red, and a particular design that made certain people lock their doors and pretend their lights weren't on. She'd heard the stories her whole life, fights in bar parking lots, drug connections, violence that nobody ever fully confirmed, but that everybody seemed to know about secondhand. Her neighbor Linda had called her just 2 hours before, after seeing the weather reports and knowing Olivia was working late, and said exactly what she'd said. "Lock that door." Olivia stood at the window and watched 59 motorcycles pull off the highway and into her parking lot. They came in slow, careful, not the way she'd imagined outlaw bikers drove, reckless, aggressive, looking for something to break. They came in the way people drive when they're exhausted and cold, and they've been fighting wind for a long time, and they're just trying to stop. She could see it even through the snow, the way some of them sat too stiff in the saddle, the way a few of them were hunched forward against the handlebars, not leaning back with attitude, but pressed forward, like their bodies were trying to conserve the last of something. She had her hand on the light switch. Linda's words were right there, and then she saw it happen. A rider in the middle of the group she couldn't make out much. Just a dark figure on a dark bike seemed to slow down even as the others were stopping, and then the bike tilted wrong too far, and then it went over. Not violently, not a crash, more like a slow surrender, like the man on it simply didn't have anything left to hold it up. The bike went down on its side and the rider went with it, and then 2 of the other bikers were off their bikes and running through the snow toward him. And Olivia could see them trying to get him up, and she could see, even through 2 inches of glass and a curtain of snow, that he wasn't getting up on his own. She took her hand off the light switch. She thought about her father. She thought about the specific way he used to say things, not dramatic, just matter of fact, like he was reporting weather. He'd said a lot of things she carried with her. But there was one thing he'd said when she was about 12 years old, after they'd seen a man's car broken down on the highway in the summer heat and driven past it, and her father had gone half a mile before he said anything, and then he'd said it like it cost him something. You learn who people really are when they need help the most, and you learn who you are too. Then he'd turned the truck around. Olivia unlocked the front door and pushed it open against the wind. The cold hit her like a wall. She'd been standing in a heated diner, or what passed for heated on her lowest propane setting, and the outside air was somewhere around 5 degrees with a wind chill that took it down below that, and it went right through her sweater and her jeans and hit her skin, and she gasped before she could stop herself. But she kept moving. She got to the edge of the porch and she called out loud enough to carry over the wind. "Hey, bring him inside, bring him in." The 2 men who were crouched next to the fallen rider looked up at her. There was a pause, just a second or two, and then a third man, taller than the others, separated from the group and walked toward her through the snow. He moved like a man who was used to people getting out of his way, not because he was threatening, but because there was something in the way he carried himself that said he'd seen enough of the world that very little surprised him anymore. His face was weathered, his beard had more gray in it than dark. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. "You sure about that?" he said. It wasn't a challenge, he was actually asking. There was something almost careful in his voice. "I'm sure about that man on the ground," Olivia said. "Get him in here. The rest of you can come in and warm up. I've got coffee and I've got food." He looked at her for another second. Then he turned and raised his voice, not yelling, but carrying the voice of a man who'd given orders for a long time. "On your feet, let's move. Help Michael." His name was Jack Morgan. Olivia wouldn't learn that for another 20 minutes. She learned Michael's name first because Michael was the one they carried through her door. He was younger than she expected. Late 20s maybe. He had a jawline beard that was crusted with ice, and his lips had gone the wrong color, and when they set him down on the bench seat of the nearest booth, his head lolled against the back cushion, and his eyes opened only part way. She'd seen hypothermia before. Her father had treated a hiker once years ago, same presentation. The confusion, the pale skin, the way the shivering goes from violent to ominously quiet. How long was he exposed? She said, not to anyone in particular, just out loud. Hour and a half, maybe, said one of the men who'd helped carry him. Bike broke down further back. He was trying to walk the shoulder before we found him. Hour and a half, Olivia said. Oin. She was already moving. She went behind the counter, grabbed the stack of clean tablecloths she kept folded near the linen shelf. They were thick cotton, she kept the good ones, and came back and started layering them over Michael without ceremony. Don't let him sleep. Keep talking to him. You know what you're doing, Jack Morgan said. He'd come in with the others and was standing near the booth, watching her. My father used to do search and rescue volunteer work, she said. I was his kid. I went on calls. Keep him awake. She didn't wait to see if Jack was going to argue. She went to the kitchen, and she turned on the glass range and put a pot of water on and pulled the big stock pot from the lower cabinet and started filling it at the sink. Warm water, not hot, was dangerous with hypothermia. You had to bring the core temperature up slow or you'd cause cardiac shock. Her hands were working from memory from 12 years old. From a cold autumn afternoon on a mountainside where her father had crouched next to a shaking man and talked to her, steadily explaining what he was doing and why, like the best classroom, was always a real situation. She was aware in a distant way that her diner was filling up with people. She could hear the door opening and closing. Feel the changes in the air pressure each time it did hear the scrape of boots on the tile floor and the low murmur of men talking to each other in voices they were clearly trying to keep down. That surprised her. She would have expected louder. She would have expected the kind of presence that fills a room and announces itself. What she was getting instead was something quieter than that, more careful. She came out of the kitchen with 2 mugs of warm water, not coffee, not yet warm water first, and a bottle of honey from behind the counter. And she went back to Michael's booth, and she said to the man sitting with him, "Make him drink this slowly. I mean slowly. Small sips." "Got it," the man said. Jack Morgan was still there. He was leaning against the end of the booth, not crowding the space, just present. "What else do you need?" he said. "Nothing right now," Olivia said. "I've got it." "I can see that," he said. And the way he said it wasn't the way men said things to her that meant they were surprised she could handle something. It was something different from that. It sounded like what it was, which was that he could actually see it, and he was just saying so. She went back behind the counter and she looked out at the room. 59 men. She'd counted the bikes when they came in. Some of them had taken their helmets off and set them on the table. Some of them were still wearing their jackets, dripping snow on her floor. A few of them had already found a booth and were sitting with their elbows on the table and their heads down, the posture of extreme exhaustion. One of them was asleep, sitting up. She watched him for a second, this big man with 4 arms like fence posts, slumped in a booth in her diner, asleep like a child. She picked up the coffee pot. She walked out from behind the counter and she started filling cups. She didn't make an announcement. She didn't say anything. She just walked from table to table and poured coffee, and the men looked up as she came, and she could see the thing she hadn't expected to see, which was that they looked at her the way you look at someone who's doing you a genuine kindness when you didn't ask for it and weren't sure you'd get it. She saw it on their faces. She felt it in the way the room got a little quieter when she moved through it. An older man with a white braid over one shoulder and hands that shook slightly held his mug with both of them. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "You want pea? I've got apple and blueberry." He blinked at her. "Are you serious?" "The blueberry's better." "Then blueberry," he said. She got the pie. She went back and forth for the next half hour, coffee and food moving through the room, and she was aware the whole time that the men were watching her, but not in a way that made her feel watched. They were watching her the way you watch someone when you're trying to figure out who they actually are. She understood that. She was doing the same thing. What she was figuring out was these were not the men she'd been told about. Not that she'd expected them to be exactly what the story said. She'd never been entirely comfortable with the stories. They were always secondhand, always told by people who'd also only heard them secondhand, and they had the smooth, simplified shape of things that get passed from person to person until all the complication has been worn away. but she'd held some version of them in her mind anyway, the way you do, because you don't have anything else to replace it with. What she was replacing it with now was a man with white hair sleeping in her corner booth. A young kid, he couldn't be more than 22, who'd asked her where the bathroom was and said please without being reminded to. A man who'd pulled out his wallet when she set food in front of him and who she'd had to tell twice that tonight there was no charge before he put it back. Two men in the back booth who were talking to each other in low voices with the ease of people who have been in enough serious situations together that they can sit in silence or speak without either one feeling like the other one has gone somewhere. And Michael in the front booth, who was starting to shiver more now, which was actually a good sign, the body fighting back, and who had gotten his eyes open properly and was holding the mug himself. "How you feeling?" Olivia said, stopping at his booth. "Like garbage," Michael said. "That's good," she said. "Means you're feeling." He looked at her. He had dark brown eyes and something moved through them, surprise maybe, or something softer than surprise. "You're the one who called us in, yes." "Why?" he said. She thought about it for a moment. She didn't want to give him a speech. She didn't want to say what her father had said because it wasn't the kind of thing that should be quoted, it should just be lived. So she said, "You fell." Michael looked at her for a long second. Then he looked down at the mug in his hands. "Okay," he said quietly. Jack Morgan had drifted over at some point the way he seemed to do, always appearing at the edge of conversations without announcing himself. "She's been feeding the whole room," he said to Michael. "Wouldn't take a dime." "I'll take a dime," Olivia said. Jack's mouth moved. She wasn't sure she'd call it a smutty exactly. It was something more careful than a smile. "We'll handle it," Heva said on. "I'm not asking you to handle it." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why we will." She went back to the counter. The clock above the pie case said it was 20 past midnight. Gracie was still asleep in the back room. The storm was still going outside the windows, rattling at intervals with gusts that shook the whole front wall. But inside the diner there was warmth, and there was coffee, and there were 59 people who had come in from the cold. Around 1 in the morning, a man named Curtis. She'd learned his name when he introduced himself apologetically and then insisted on helping her wash the dish load that had backed up, told her that the group had been traveling from a chapter meetup in Great Falls. They'd known the storm was coming, but the weather models had shown it moving north by early evening. The models were wrong. "Michael's bike threw a chain about 20 miles back," Curtis said. He was drying a cup with a kitchen towel, perfectly at home in her kitchen, in a way that should have felt strange and didn't. He stopped to fix it, and the temperature just dropped faster than any of us realized. By the time Jack noticed he was missing, Michael had been out there a while. "How close did it get?" Olivia said. Curtis looked at her. "Close," he said. "It got close." She thought about that. She thought about the $43 in her register and the letter from the bank on her corkboard. She thought about what would have happened if she'd listened to Linda and locked the door and pretended the lights were off. Michael Reyes would have been a news story. He might have been a tragedy. Or maybe someone else down the highway might have found him in time, probably she told herself. She didn't know. What she knew was that she hadn't locked the door. "He's going to be okay," she said. It wasn't a question. "Because of you," Curtis said. "Because of warm blankets in warm water and basic common sense," she said. "His body did the work." Curtis looked at her in that way again, the way they all kept looking at her like she was something they were still in the process of understanding. "You always this modest," he said. "I'm always this tired," she said. He laughed. It was a good laugh, genuine. "Fair enough." Around 2 in the morning, the storm began to ease slightly, and Jack Morgan came to the counter and sat down across from her. Not all the way across, he sat at the counter on a stool, and she was on the working side with her coffee, and it felt like two people who'd been through a long night together sitting down for the first time. "Tell me about this place," he said. It was a direct question, and she didn't know why she answered it directly, but she did. Maybe because the whole night had been direct. She told him about her father and the 31 years, and the letter from the bank, and Danny, and the second mortgage she hadn't known existed, and the 60-day window that was now 11 days, and the $43 in the register. She didn't mean to tell him all of it. It came out in pieces, one thing leading to the next, and he listened without interrupting, which was rarer than most people thought. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Why are you still fighting for it?" he said. "Because my father built it," she said. "There are other ways to honor your father." Yeah, she said, but this is the one I've got. He was quiet again. She watched him think. He had one of those faces that showed the thinking not dramatically, just the slight change in the eyes, the way his attention sharpened and moved and settled. People like you are rare, he said finally. It came out low, like he was saying it to himself as much as to her. The world asks hard things of you, and you just keep going. Most people keep going, Olivia said. Most people keep going until they hit a wall, he said. You hit that wall, and you opened a door. She didn't have an answer for that. Around 4 in the morning, with the storm finally dropping, and Michael Reyes sitting up fully in his booth and talking and even laughing at something one of his brothers said, Jack Morgan left a number of folded bills on the counter that Olivia didn't look at until after they'd all gone. He stood up and he put on his jacket and he looked at her from across the counter and he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. People like you, people who open doors when everyone's telling them to lock them, those people don't get forgotten. Not by us. He paused. We take care of our own. And tonight you made yourself one of our own, whether you wanted to or not. She almost told him that wasn't necessary. She didn't say anything. Before 6 in the morning, they were gone. The storm had passed enough to ride, and Jack had gotten word that the road north was clear. They went the way they'd come, quietly, more carefully than she expected, and the last bike pulled out of her lot as the first gray light was starting to show over the mountains. Olivia stood on the porch in the cold and watched them go. Then she went inside and she looked at the bills Jack had left on the counter. She counted them 3 times. $840, everything in the room probably. She thought about these men emptying their wallets, the way soldiers share rations. No discussion about it, just a collective decision made without anyone saying it needed to be made. She thought about the man with the shaking hands who'd eaten blueberry pie and said, "Thank you, ma'am." She put the money in the register. She put the chairs down from the tables. She started a fresh pot of coffee. She checked on Gracie, who was still sleeping, her small face still and beautiful in the gray early light coming through the back room window. Olivia stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter for a long moment. She thought about what she was teaching her. She thought about the things that get passed down without you planning it, the way her father had turned a truck around on a summer highway and said something that she'd never forgotten. She thought, I hope she was awake for some of it. I hope she saw some piece of it. I hope she knows what we did here tonight. She went back to the counter. She poured herself a coffee, and she looked at the corkboard with the bank letter pinned to it under the trout magnet. 11 days, $840. She was still losing. The math hadn't changed. But she was still standing, and the door was still open. And she had absolutely no idea that in 3 days the ground was going to shake. The $840 lasted 9 days. Olivia knew it would. She'd done the math the same morning she counted the bills, standing at the counter with her coffee going cold beside her. And she'd known then that the number was meaningful, but not enough the way a life jacket is meaningful when the shore is still 2 miles away. It bought her time. It didn't buy her out. On the 9th day, she made a phone call to the bank and spoke to a man named Gerald Haas, who had a voice like he'd been trained to deliver bad news in a tone that implied it was actually good news. And he explained to her again patiently in the way people explain things to someone they have already decided isn't going to find a solution, that the foreclosure window was now 2 days out and that the amount required to halt proceedings was not a number she had. I understand your situation is difficult, Gerald Haas said. Do you, Olivia said. There was a pause. Ms. Whitmore, if there's a family member or... Thank you for your time, she said, and she hung up. She stood behind the counter and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way she'd taught herself to do in the months after Danny left, in the early weeks when panic used to come up on her fast and without warning, like a trap door opening under her feet. She'd learned to breathe through it, to stay vertical, to keep her hands doing something useful while her mind caught up to whatever the new reality was. She picked up the coffee pot and she wiped down the counter. It was a Thursday morning. She had 2 customers. Pete Larson from the hardware store, who came in every Thursday for eggs and toast, and a woman traveling through who'd stop for coffee and directions. Olivia gave Pete his eggs the way he liked them, over medium toast, dark but not burned, and she refilled the traveling woman's coffee twice without being asked, and she smiled at both of them the way she always smiled, which was not a performance, but not the whole truth either. When they left, the diner was empty. She went to the corkboard. She unpinned the bank letter and she read it one more time, all of it, though she had most of it memorized. Then she put it back. She looked at the trout magnet her father had bought at a gas station in Wyoming, and she thought about him for a minute. Not a sad thought, more like a conversation she was trying to have with someone who wasn't there anymore. She thought, I'm trying, Dad. I don't know what else to do, but I'm still trying. The door to the back room opened, and Gracie came out in her pajamas, the stuffed rabbit hanging from one hand, her dark hair flattened on one side from sleeping. She looked at her mother with the clear, uncomplicated assessment that 6-year-olds had before the world taught them to complicate it. You look tired, Gracie said. Good morning to you too, Olivia said. Did you sleep? Some. Gracie climbed up onto a counter stool. She'd been doing it herself for 2 years, didn't want help anymore, and set a rabbit on the counter beside her. And I dreamed about the motorcycle men, she said. Olivia looked at her. What about them? They were nice in my dream, Gracie said. The big one with the gray beard gave me a piece of pie. That sounds like something that happened, Olivia said. It didn't, Gracie said. I was asleep. I know you were, but it felt real. Gracie turned her rabbit over in her hands the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. Mama, were they actually nice, or were they pretending? Olivia thought about how to answer that. She thought about the man with the shaking hands and the folded bills on the counter, and Curtis washing dishes in her kitchen with a kitchen towel folded over his shoulder. She thought about Jack Morgan saying you made yourself one of our own, and the particular way he'd said it like he meant the word. They were actually nice, she said. Gracie nodded, satisfied. That's what I thought, she said. I just wanted to make sure your version matched mine. Olivia laughed, a real one, the kind that surprised her. Go brush your teeth, she said. Can I have pancakes? Yes. With the blueberries? We're almost out of blueberries. But almost out means some, Gracie said. It means some, Olivia agreed. She made the pancakes. She watched her daughter eat them at the counter, with the rabbit propped beside the syrup, and she held on to that moment the way you hold on to things you know are good while you still have them, which is something you only learn to do after you've lost a few things you didn't appreciate in time. The day passed. 2 more customers at lunch. A family of 4 passing through in the early afternoon, highway travelers who ordered burgers and fries and were grateful and quick about it. She did $32 in business on a Thursday, which was a bad day even by her standards. And at 3 o'clock, she sat down in the booth nearest the window, and she let herself feel it for exactly 5 minutes. The weight of it, the specific exhaustion of fighting something that kept fighting back. She set her elbows on the table and put her face in her hands, and she breathed in the dark behind her palms. 5 minutes. Then she got up and she started prepping for dinner service. She didn't know what else to do, so she kept going. Linda Bauer showed up at 4, which was Linda's habit a couple times a week, arriving just before the dinner rush as if by accident, when in reality she came because she was the kind of person who noticed when someone needed company and had enough grace not to say so directly. Linda was 63 and had lived in Red Valley her whole life and knew everything about everyone delivered without malice, which was a rare combination. She settled at the counter with her hands around a coffee mug, and she said without preamble, Gerald Haas called Roy Benton this morning. Olivia stopped what she was doing. Roy Benton was on the town council and had been for 20 years and was the person in Red Valley who people called when the official channels needed a human interpreter. Why would Gerald Haas call Roy Benton, she said. Because Gerald Haas is from here originally, Linda said. His mother was Donna Haas, lived on Sycamore. She used to bring cookies to the church social every year until her knees gave out in 2009. Roy went to school with Gerald. Gerald called to ask Roy to let you know privately that the bank isn't looking for reasons to foreclose, they just need something on paper to justify extending. Anything. A payment plan proposal, a third-party letter, a committed investor. Olivia looked at her. Did Gerald Haas actually say that? Roy said Gerald Haas said, and I'm quoting Roy, quoting Gerald, tell her if she can give us something to work with, we can work with it. Olivia set down the spatula she'd been holding. She leaned against the counter. Linda, I don't have an investor. I don't have a payment plan. I have tomorrow. I know, Linda said. Then why are you telling me this? Because sometimes knowing a door is cracked open is different from knowing a door is shut, Linda said, even if you don't know what's on the other side yet. They looked at each other. I'm scared, Olivia said. She didn't say it often. She didn't say it to almost anyone. But Linda had shown up 4 times in the first month after Danny left, each time with food that she set on the counter, and didn't make a production of, and she'd earned it. I know you are, Linda said. You're also the woman who let 59 bikers into her diner in a blizzard. That was different. Was it? That was one night, Olivia said. This is everything. This is the whole thing. Linda was quiet for a moment. Your father was scared every year in March, she said. Did you know that every spring, when the slow season ended and the bills came in from winter, Roy would get very quiet for about 2 weeks? Worked late, didn't talk much. I asked him about it once, and he said, Linda, I'm afraid every spring, but I'm still here every summer. She paused. He was here every summer, Olivia. Every single one. Olivia pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, Linda said and picked up her coffee. The dinner service was thin, but not empty, and Olivia worked it alone the way she always did, moving fast and clean, the diner's kitchen, being the one space in her life where she felt entirely competent in a way that didn't require any maintenance. She knew where everything was. She knew the timing of every item on the menu by instinct. She could run 4 orders at once without writing anything down. Her father had taught her that. He'd said the kitchen was a living thing and you had to learn its rhythms, and once you did, it would carry you. She'd found in the hard months that he was right. She was pulling a pie from the oven around 7:30 when she heard the bell over the front door. She called out, "Be right with you," and slid the pie onto the cooling rack, and when she came out of the kitchen, she stopped. Michael Reyes was standing in her doorway. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him, which was the morning 3 days ago when they'd carried him out to a bike because he still wasn't steady enough on his own, and he'd looked at her from the parking lot with an expression she hadn't been able to fully read. He looked different now. He looked like himself, or like what she imagined himself was. He was standing on his own, and there was color in his face, and he was wearing a clean jacket, and he held a helmet under his arm, and he looked at her with those dark brown eyes and said, "Hi." "Hi," she said. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "in person, when I could actually stand without embarrassing myself." "You didn't embarrass yourself," she said. "I fell off my bike," he said. "Your body was shutting down. That's not embarrassing, that's physics." He smiled. It changed his face significantly. He was younger looking when he smiled, and the smile was the kind that didn't have any calculation in it. "Can I sit down, please?" she said. He sat at the counter. She poured him coffee without asking, and he wrapped his hands around the mug the same way the old man with the white braid had, and she thought about how hands told you things. "How are you actually feeling?" she said. "Good," he said. "Doctors said another hour out there and the conversation might have been different." He said it straightforwardly, not for drama, just because it was true. "Jack told me what you did, not just letting us in. The water, the blankets, keeping me awake. You knew what you were doing." "My father taught me." "Jack told me about your father too," Michael said. "About this place." She looked at him. "Jack talks a lot for a man who seems like he wouldn't." Michael laughed. "He doesn't talk to most people, that's the thing. When he talks, it means something." He turned the mug in his hands. "He told me about the bank, the foreclosure." The air in the room changed slightly. Olivia felt it. She kept her face neutral. "He shouldn't have said that." "He didn't say it like gossip," Michael said. "He said it like a fact that mattered to him." "It's my business to handle," she said. "Nobody said it wasn't." She looked at him. He looked back. He wasn't flinching, and he wasn't pushing. He was just being there, which was its own kind of thing. "Why did you come back?" she said. "Really, you could have sent a card." "Jack wanted to come himself," Michael said. "He had chapter business, he couldn't move, so he asked me to come instead." He said, he paused like he was trying to get the words right. "He said to tell you that what you did for us opening that door, he's been thinking about it. He said some people do things from obligation. Some people do things from fear, and some people do things because they're just built that way. He said you're built that way." She didn't say anything for a moment. "He also said to give you this," Michael said. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and he put an envelope on the counter. Olivia looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up. "What is that?" she said. Not a question exactly. "Open it," Michael said. She opened it. Inside was a piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was a letter handwritten in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that takes longer than it used to, because the writer has decided that things worth saying deserve to be written properly. The letter was from Jack Morgan. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said what he'd sent Michael to say in person. The second paragraph said that the Hellfire Road chapter and 7 affiliated chapters had taken a collection and that the collection was attached. She looked at the bottom of the envelope. There was a cashier's check. She took it out with 2 fingers. She looked at the number, and the ground went out from under her, not in the bad way, in the other way, the way it goes when something impossible happens and your body has to take a second to catch up to it. $47,000. That's, she said, and then she stopped. Because her voice had done something she hadn't given it permission to do. It's enough to cover the foreclosure and the private loan and still have something left for repairs, Michael said. He said it gently, not like a speech, like something he'd thought about how to say. Jack said it's not charity. He said to write down somewhere that it's repayment, that the night you opened that door you gave us back something that cost more than money, and this is the only currency he has. She put the check flat on the counter. She put both her palms on the counter on either side of it. She breathed. I can't accept this, she said. Jack said you'd say that, Michael said. He was right. He also said to tell you that the chapter voted on it, Michael said. All 8 chapters. It was unanimous. He said when something is unanimous, there's not a lot of room for one person's refusal, with all due respect. She looked up at him. He held her look steadily. He had the patience of someone who'd been in situations where patience was the thing that mattered. I don't know these people, she said. Except for that one night, I don't know Jack Morgan. I made coffee and I kept someone warm. That's not worth... You kept me alive, Michael said, quietly. With respect, that's what happened. In Jack Morgan, he lost a kid brother 15 years ago. Exposure, wrong place, wrong weather. Nobody stopped. He paused. I'm not saying that to make you feel responsible. I'm saying it because when Jack says you gave us something that costs more than money, I know exactly what he means, and I think you deserve to know too. The diner was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the highway. The pie was cooling on the rack in the kitchen. Olivia picked up the check. She looked at it again at the number, and she thought about the bank letter on the corkboard. She thought about Gerald Haas telling Roy Benton, if she can give us something to work with, we can work with it. She thought about her father, quiet every March, still there every summer. I'm going to pay it back, she said. That's between you and Jack, Michael said. No, I'm telling you as a witness, she said. I'm going to pay it back. I don't know how long it takes, but I'm going to pay every dollar of it back. Michael looked at her for a long moment. You know what Jack would say to that? What? He'd say, then we'll all have something to look forward to. She almost laughed. She got partway there. Tell him. She stopped. She tried to find the right thing. She thought about everything she'd have said if she'd been standing in front of Jack Morgan himself, and she thought about how none of it would be enough and all of it was true. Tell him I said we're even on the door, but the rest he's given me, something I don't have words for. Michael nodded. He finished his coffee. He set the mug down with the care of someone who noticed things. He also said, one more thing, Michael said. He said you should know that when he left here the other morning, he told the story, not on purpose. It just came out the way things do when they matter. He told it at a fuel stop, and then 3 other people told it at the next stop, and now... He paused. He said you should know the story is traveling, and that some things, once they start moving, don't stop. Olivia frowned slightly. What does that mean? He wasn't sure, Michael said. He just said you should be ready. She wanted to ask what she should be ready for, but Michael had already stood up and put on his helmet, and he was heading for the door, and at the door he turned and said, Best coffee I've had in 3 states, by the way, and I've been in a lot of states. Then he went out, and a moment later she heard his bike start, and then the sound of it moving away down the highway and going quiet. She stood alone in the diner. She looked at the check on the counter. Then she looked at the corkboard with the bank letter under the trout magnet. She walked to the phone. She called the bank's overnight line, got the after-hours voicemail for Gerald Haas's department, and left a message that said she would be calling first thing tomorrow morning with funds to satisfy the outstanding balance and halt the foreclosure proceedings. She hung up. She sat down on the stool behind the counter. The clock above the pie case said 7:54. Gracie would be wanting her bath. The pie on the rack needed to be wrapped. The kitchen needed to be closed down. She sat there for another minute. She thought about a story traveling. She thought about the way Michael had said some things once they start moving, don't stop. She thought she probably should have asked him what Jack thought was coming. She thought about the word ready and how she didn't know if she was. But she'd thought that once before on a snowy night 9 days ago, standing at a window with her hand on a light switch, and she'd been wrong about that too. She got up. She wrapped the pie. She closed the kitchen. She ran Gracie's bath. She didn't sleep well. Not because anything was wrong, because something was shifting. And even when a shift is in the right direction, you can feel the ground moving under you, and you don't know yet where it's going to settle. 3 days later, she found out. She was behind the counter at 7:40 in the morning. The early coffee crowd, such as it was, settled into their usual spots. Pete Larson with his eggs, Linda with a muffin she hadn't asked for, but Olivia had put in front of her anyway. Gracie was in the back room doing the workbook pages Olivia set out for her each morning, small tasks to make the mornings feel structured. The radio was on low. The morning was ordinary. Then Linda stopped mid-sentence. Olivia looked up. Linda was facing the window. Her face had gone still in a way that Olivia associated with Linda seeing something she was trying to make sense of. Olivia, Linda said, but will come here. Olivia came around the counter and stood beside Linda. She looked out the window. There was a sound she'd been half aware of for the past 30 seconds, something she'd categorized without thinking as a truck on the highway, which was normal. But it wasn't one truck. It wasn't one of anything. The ground was shaking, not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but there was a vibration low and constant and building the kind that you feel in your feet before you can properly hear it. Pete Larson had stood up from his booth. He was looking out the window too. Is that, he started. The sound became a roar, not a violent roar, not threatening, but enormous, the kind of sound that changes the air pressure in a room. And then the highway was filled with motorcycles. Olivia put her hand on the windowsill. There were so many. They came from the north, a line that stretched back so far. She couldn't see the end of it, and they weren't going fast. They were coming in, measured, deliberate, filling the two lanes and still coming. The sound was everything. It was the whole world for a moment, that sound. Linda made a sound that was almost a word. Pete Larson said, Lord have mercy. Olivia couldn't say anything. They kept coming, and she was counting without meaning to the way you count when something is too big to take in all at once, and counting gives you something to hold on to. She stopped at somewhere past 200, and she was barely a quarter of the way through the line. A hand tugged her sleeve. She looked down. Gracie had come out of the back room and was standing beside her in her pajamas, rabbit in hand, looking out the window at the highway. Her face was not scared. It was wide-eyed and wondering, the face of a child watching something she understood was not ordinary. Mama, she said, are those the same ones? Olivia's throat was very tight. Some of them, she said. There's more this time, Gracie said. Yes, Olivia said, there are more this time. The first bikes were already turning into the parking lot, and still the line on the highway kept coming. The diner's windows rattled gently in the vibration of it, the same way they'd rattled in the storm, and Olivia thought about that, the storm, and the sound she'd heard, and the choice she'd made, and where that choice had carried her. She thought about her father saying, you learn who people really are when they need help the most. She thought about what it meant that more than 1,000 people had shown up on a Tuesday morning for someone they'd never met, for someone they only knew through a story that was traveling. She looked at her daughter beside her. She made a decision. She went behind the counter. She put on her apron. She started the biggest coffee urn she had, the 30-cup one she only used for events. She pulled out every mug she owned. Linda appeared at her elbow. What do you need? She said. Everything, Olivia said. Tell me where to start. Coffee, Olivia said. Start with the coffee. Outside, the motorcycles kept coming. And Olivia Whitmore, who had opened a door once on the worst night she could remember, stood in her father's diner, and she kept her hands moving the way he'd taught her, the way you do when the thing coming towards you is larger than anything you plan for. But you've decided at some point you can't quite identify that you're not going to close the door. Not now, not ever again. They kept coming for 40 minutes. Olivia knew this because the clock above the pie case was the only thing she looked at besides the faces in front of her and the mugs in her hands. And for 40 unbroken minutes, the sound outside didn't stop, and the line of motorcycles on the highway didn't end, and the parking lot filled, and then the lot next to the parking lot filled, and then the shoulder of the highway itself became a parking strip stretching back in both directions further than she could see from the window. 40 minutes. By the time the last bike settled, Linda had called her sister Carol to come help, and Carol had called her neighbor Patrice, and Patrice had shown up with her teenage son Marcus and a flat of eggs from her own refrigerator, and none of them had been asked. They had simply appeared the way people do in small towns when something is happening that is larger than one person. The diner that seated 42 people had somewhere north of 150 people in it on every surface that could hold a person and another several hundred outside, and Olivia had stopped counting the motorcycles at 800 because the number had become something her mind couldn't fully process, and she needed her mind for other things. She needed it for the coffee and the eggs and the order in her kitchen, and the particular arithmetic of feeding a crowd with a short order setup and a single range. She needed it for keeping her hands steady. Jack Morgan came through the front door with the same unhurried gravity he'd had that first night, the kind of presence that doesn't announce itself, but that a room feels anyway, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. He was wearing the same jacket. He looked like he had slept well and driven a long distance, which Olivia would later learn was accurate. He'd left Great Falls at 4:30 in the morning. He looked at her across the crowded diner. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he crossed the room and people moved without being asked to, and he stood at the counter and said, "I told you some things once they start moving don't stop." "You told Michael to tell me that," she said. "Same thing." "It's not really the same thing." "No," he agreed, "but I'm here now." He looked at the organized chaos around her. Linda pouring coffee at one end of the counter, Carol cracking eggs into a bowl, at a speed that suggested she had once done this professionally, young Marcus stacking mugs from the clean rack. "You need more hands." "I always need more hands. I've got about 300 of them in the parking lot," he said. "Point me at something." She pointed him at the supply room and told him to start pulling inventory. She told Marcus to run next door to the gas station and ask Ray, the owner, if he could spare any paper cups, and Ray's wife Ellen would know what she meant. She told Carol to scramble and not to worry about individual orders, that when you had this many people, you fed them family style or you didn't feed them at all. And then she turned back to the line of people forming at her counter and she started handing out coffee. And she did it the way she always did, moving from person to person, looking them in the eye, saying thank you for coming. The same way she'd say it to any customer on any morning. Because she'd learned long ago that dignity was a thing. You offered people the same way you offered them coffee without making a production of it. The stories started coming to her in pieces. That was the thing nobody told her about afterward when they wrote it up, and people did write it up, but that came later. What nobody described was the way the stories came to her in small, discrete moments while she was pouring coffee or handing over plates. Quick conversations that lasted 30 seconds or a minute before the crowd moved her on, and each one carried a piece of something she was slowly assembling into a picture larger than she'd known she was painting. A man named Vernon, who had a Red Valley chapter patch and a face that put him somewhere in his mid-50s, told her he'd heard the story at a fuel stop in Missoula 2 days ago. He said the way he'd heard it, a woman alone had kept a dying man alive through a blizzard using only what she had in her kitchen. And he'd thought about his own mother, who'd been a woman alone for most of her life. And he'd thought about all the times people had looked at women like that, capable, quiet, holding everything together, and looked right past them. He said he wasn't going to look past this one. A woman in Olivia was surprised there were women, maybe 20 or 30 of them, in the group riders, in their own right named Deb, who had short silver hair and wore her patch with the ease of someone who'd earned it a long time ago, grabbed Olivia's wrist gently as she's passed and said, "My chapter's out of Spokane. 14 of us drove 4 hours this morning. I need you to know that's not something we do. That's not a thing we do, just showing up somewhere for a stranger." But Jack Morgan made one phone call and everyone said yes. Everyone. Olivia asked her why. Deb said, "Because the story was true. You can always tell when a story is true. The details are too specific. The woman had $43 in her register. The little girl was asleep in the back. The man's lips had gone blue." She paused. When a story has details like that, it's not something someone made up to feel good about people. It's something that actually happened. Olivia thought about the $43. She hadn't told anyone that number. She told Jack. Jack must have told someone, and somehow it had traveled that specific, unglamorous, humbling number, traveling from Jack to whoever he'd told, and from them outward until it arrived in Spokane in the mouth of a story that Deb heard and believed because $43 was not the kind of detail you invented. She kept moving. She had to keep moving. Around 9:32, things happened at nearly the same time, and together they hit her the way two waves hit differently than one. The first was that a man came in from outside and asked for Jack Morgan, and Jack came out from the supply room where he'd been taking inventory with the efficient focus of someone who understood logistics, and the two of them spoke in low voices near the hallway, and then Jack came to find Olivia. He waited until she was between customers, which he was good at. He had the patience to wait for the right moment without being passive about it. "There are people outside with trucks," he said. She looked at my trucks, work trucks. "Some of them drove up this morning with tools and materials." He said it matter-of-factly, not like an announcement. "We've got 2 licensed electricians, 1 master plumber, 4 carpenters, a roofer." He brought a crew and about 40 people who may not have specific skills, but who are strong and take direction. "Ronnie, he's the roofer. He took a look at your roof line from the parking lot and said he can see where you're losing heat from where he's standing." Olivia stood very still. "Jack?" "I know," he said. "This is too much." "It's not enough," he said. "I'm telling you right now, it's not enough for what we owe." He said it without drama, just the plain delivery of a man who'd done the calculation and arrived at an answer he was comfortable with. "The question is whether you're going to let us help, or whether we're going to have to stand in your parking lot looking at your roof for the rest of the day." She searched his face for something to argue with and didn't find it. "Tell Ronnie to come in," she said. "I want to talk to him before anyone gets on my roof." The second thing that happened at 9:30 was that Roy Benton walked in. Roy Benton, who had been on the town council for 20 years and who had delivered Gerald Haas's message through Linda, was not a man who walked into situations without having thought about them first. He was methodical and careful, and in Olivia's experience, he tended to arrive late to things he privately supported and early to things he publicly opposed. And so the fact that he was walking into her diner at 9:30 in the morning, on the day 1,500 bikers had arrived, was a data point. He stood inside the door and he looked around the room with the expression of a man who had thought he was prepared for what he was walking into and discovered he was not. Then he made his way to the counter and he caught Olivia's eye and he said with the careful tone of someone finding their footing on unfamiliar ground, "Olivia, this is quite something." "It is," she agreed. "How are you?" He gestured, not quite finding the word. "Handling it," she offered. "Yes, 1 cup at a time," she said. Roy nodded. He was a tall man with a deliberate manner, and something in him seemed to be recalibrating in real time the way people do when reality exceeds their model of it. "I've gotten 3 calls from the mayor this morning," he said, "and 2 from the state police just checking on road conditions." He paused. "And 1 from the Billings Gazette, and 1 from Helena." Olivia stopped pouring. "Helena?" "A reporter. Apparently it's the story's been circulating online. Social media." He said the phrase with the mild discomfort of a 60-year-old man using tools he understood were powerful, but didn't fully trust. "Someone posted something 2 days ago. I'm told it has quite a number of shares." "How many?" Olivia said. Roy cleared his throat. "The mayor said the reporter mentioned 180,000. Olivia put the coffee pot down. She put it down because she needed a moment where her hands were not doing something, which was rare for her and felt strange. 180,000. She thought about Michael saying some things once they start moving, "Don't stop." She thought about the specific gravity in his voice when he'd said it like he knew something she didn't yet. And now she was standing on the other side of the knowing, and the number was 180,000, and that was people who had read about a woman with $43 in her register, and a diner with a cracked roof, and a 6-year-old asleep in the back, and had passed it on. 180,000 times someone had looked at this story and decided it was worth sharing. She picked the coffee pot back up. "Tell the mayor the road conditions are fine," she said. "Tell him to call me directly if he needs anything else. And Roy," she paused, "thank you for what you did with Gerald Haas. You didn't have to do that." Roy Benton looked at her. Something shifted in his face that she didn't have a word for, but recognized the look of a man who'd underestimated something and was quietly, privately revising. "Your father was a good man, Olivia," he said. "He deserved better than to have what he built taken apart by a bank letter. He picked up his coffee. So do you. He found a seat at the end of the counter, and he stayed for 2 hours. And at one point, she saw him talking to Jack Morgan in a booth in the back. The two of them leaning slightly toward each other, the way people do when the conversation is real. And she didn't know what they said, but whatever it was, Roy left looking different from when he'd arrived. Ronnie the roofer was a broad, sun-weathered man with a Red Valley chapter patch and hands that made her own look small. He came in and shook her hand, a real handshake, and then he sat at the counter for 10 minutes while she worked around him, and he told her what he'd seen from the parking lot, which was more than she'd expected him to be able to see. He talked about heat loss and structural integrity, and a section of flashing on the north face that had been failing for 2 winters, at least based on the rust pattern, and he said it all in the straightforward language of someone who respects the person they're talking to enough to give them the real information and not the simplified version. How long would it take, she said. Roofing, electrical, and the heating system. He thought for a moment. I've got my crew 8 people. The electricians are good. I've worked with both of them. 2-3 days for the main work. Another day or 2 for the finish items. We can do it clean. I can't pay your crew, she said. I want to say that directly. He looked at her like she'd said something faintly absurd. This isn't a job, he said. Don't insult my crew by trying to pay them. I'm not trying to insult anyone, she said. I'm trying to be honest. Then here's honest, Ronnie said. I've been writing with Jack Morgan's chapter for 11 years. I've watched Jack do things I've never seen another man do. I've never not once seen him personally pick up the phone and call every chapter leader in a 4-state area in 11 years. He let that settle. Whatever you did for us that night, it meant something to him that doesn't have a number on it. So please don't put a number on our end either. She held his gaze. All right, she said. All right, he said, and that was that. By 11 in the morning, the work had started. She heard it from inside, the particular sounds of a building being taken care of, which were different from the sounds of a building falling apart. Though she'd been living with the latter for so long, it took her a moment to identify the distinction. She heard boots on the roof, deliberate and patterned, not random. She heard the sound of old material being removed and the more authoritative sound of new material going on. She heard power tools from the back corner, where the electrical panel was voices calling to each other in the shorthand of people who do physical work together and have built their own language for it. Inside, she kept feeding people. At some point around noon, without any particular announcement or organizing, a kind of system had assembled itself. The riders who weren't working on the diner had formed their own order groups, taking turns coming in to eat the rest, waiting outside, moving around, talking, many of them in clusters around their bikes, having conversations that Olivia got brief glimpses of when the door opened, men sitting on bike seats or crouched on the pavement, hands around coffee cups they'd brought out with them, talking with the ease of people who spend a lot of their lives in transit and have made transit itself into a place where real conversation happens. She caught fragments of those conversations all morning through the open door, small pieces that came at her and stayed. An older rider telling a younger one about his daughter who'd stopped calling for 2 years, but had called last month. A man sitting alone reading something on his phone and laughing quietly to himself. 2 women, Deb from Spokane and another rider Olivia hadn't met, talking rapidly about something in the focused way of people who have arrived at the part of a friendship where small talk is unnecessary. She thought about the stories she'd been told, about loneliness and about judgment, and about the specific way that people like these people who wore a certain patch and rode a certain road and lived a certain life, got looked at by other people, the assumptions that got made before a word was exchanged. She thought about Linda's voice on the phone saying, "Lock that door." She thought about how close she'd come to doing it. Gracie found her at 12:30. She came out of the back room with her workbook under her arm and her rabbit in her other hand, and she climbed up onto the stool at the end of the counter, and she waited with the specific patience of a child who knows her mother is busy and has decided to be present without making demands until Olivia had a gap in the movement and came to her. "How's the workbook?" Olivia said. "Done," Gracie said. "I did the extra pages too. Both of them. All 4. Olivia looked at her daughter. "You did 4 extra pages." "I had a lot of time," Gracie said, then more quietly, "Can I go outside?" "Why?" "I want to look at the motorcycles." Olivia thought about it. "Stay on the porch. Don't go past the porch railing." "Okay. And put on your coat." "It's not cold, it's dent." "Gracie." "Okay." Gracie said and went for her coat. Olivia watched her daughter go out the front door. Through the window, she watched Gracie stand on the porch in her coat with her rabbit looking out at the parking lot full of motorcycles and the people around them. And she watched Gracie's face do the thing it did when she was taking something in, that particular stillness. The expression of a child who is deciding how to feel about something before feeling it. A man nearest the porch, 50s, heavy-set with a patch from an Oregon chapter, noticed Gracie and said something to her. Olivia tensed for a half second. Gracie said something back. The man smiled. He said something else. Gracie thought about it for a moment, and then she laughed, and it was a real laugh, the unguarded kind that Olivia recognized and that always did something to her chest. She turned back to the counter. She kept moving. The first reporter arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She came from the Billings Gazette, and she was younger than Olivia expected, mid-20s maybe, with a notebook she held in a way that suggested she was trying to look more comfortable than she was. She asked if she could speak with Olivia when there was a moment. Olivia said, "There won't be a moment today, but you can stand over there and watch if you'd like." The reporter said, "That's actually better." She stood at the end of the counter for 3 hours, and she watched, and she wrote in her notebook, and at one point, Olivia heard her say something quietly into a phone that sounded like, "This is actually not what I expected it to be." Olivia didn't ask what she'd expected. She had a feeling she already knew. The twist that nobody talked about enough, not then, not when the stories came out later, was what happened at 4:30 in the afternoon. Jack Morgan found Olivia in the kitchen during a rare 5-minute pause. She was standing at the prep counter eating a piece of bread and butter because she hadn't eaten since early morning, and her legs were starting to feel it, and Jack came in without ceremony and stood across the prep counter from her, and he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. She'd learned to read his versions of urgency, which were not like other people's versions. He didn't raise his voice or shift his posture. What changed was something in his eyes, a focus that narrowed the thing that happened to a man's face when he was about to say the thing he's been deciding whether to say. "Tell me," she said. "The story," he said. "The thing that's been traveling. It's not just online anymore. Roy told me about the reporter from Helena." "It's not just Helena," Jack said. "I got a call this morning from a producer at a network out of Chicago. Morning show. They want to send a crew." Olivia put down the bread. "They want to what?" "They've been tracking the story for 2 days. Apparently one of their researchers flagged it when it crossed 100,000 shares. It crossed 300,000 this morning." He said it evenly, not like a man impressed by numbers, but like a man reporting terrain. "They want to come here, film the diner, the work being done, talk to you and some of the chapter members. They're talking about a segment that would air nationally." The kitchen was quiet except for the sounds coming from the roof above them and the low murmur from the dining room. "Nationally," she said. "Yes. Why, Bob?" Jack tilted his head slightly. "You're asking why a story about a woman alone who saves a man's life and then receives the largest spontaneous act of community service I've ever personally witnessed is something a national news program wants to cover." She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking why now. 2 weeks ago, I was 2 days from losing this place. Nobody from Chicago was calling. 2 weeks ago, the story hadn't started moving," Jack said. "Now it has." He leaned against the counter, and in the pause, she could hear Marcus outside in the dining room as saying something that made several people laugh, and she could hear Gracie's voice, which meant Gracie had come back inside. "Olivia, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. I told the producer I'd pass it along and that the decision was yours. What do you think I should do?" He considered the question seriously the way he did everything. "I think you've been fighting alone for a long time," he said. "I think your father built something worth fighting for. I think the world knowing that story exists, what you did, what this community did, what my people did, I think that's worth something. Not for the attention, because it's true, and true things deserve to be known." She thought about Deb from Spokane saying you can always tell when a story is true. She thought about 180,000 people sharing it, and then 300,000 because the number had kept moving while she wasn't looking. She thought about all the women alone in all the diners, in all the houses, in all the small towns who were fighting the same things she was fighting, and who would turn on a morning show in Chicago or Tallahassee or Sacramento and see a story and think, "She did it. She's still there. She made it. Tell them they can come," she said. Jack nodded once. "But they work around us," she said. "I don't stop for cameras. I don't do anything different because cameras are here. They fit into what we're doing or they don't come. I'll tell them exactly that, Jack said. And I talked to Gracie first. Of course. She picked up the bread and took another bite. Have you eaten? Not since this morning. She pulled a second piece of bread from the bag and handed it to him across the prep counter. He took it. They stood in the kitchen eating bread while the sounds of a building being restored came through the walls and ceiling around them. And it was not a dramatic moment in any way that would make a good segment for a morning show in Chicago. It was just two people who had come through something together standing in a kitchen, and it was enough. It was more than enough. At 5:30, Ronnie came to find her. He found her at the counter and he said, "Come outside, I want to show you something." She followed him out the front door and he walked her around to the side of the building and he pointed up at the roof line and he said, "You see where that new flashing is running?" She looked up. In the fading afternoon light, she could see the difference, even without knowing exactly what she was looking at. The new material had a different quality, a clean authority. "We got the main section done today," Ronnie said. "Tomorrow we're doing the full electrical panel replacement and finishing the north face, day after the heating system." He paused. "You're not going to lose heat through that roof this winter. I want you to know that." She looked at the roof line. She thought about the winters she'd spent in this building, watching the heating bill climb because of exactly what he was describing. She thought about her father who had known about the flashing and had put off fixing it because something else always needed the money first. "Ronnie," she said. "Ma'am, thank you." She said it simply without the qualifications she usually put around gratitude, without the "and I'll find a way to repay you" or the "I don't know how to thank you, just thank you," he nodded. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did for Michael, for all of us." They stood there for a moment in the early evening, both of them looking up at a roof that was getting fixed, and it was a small thing, and it was not a small thing at all. When she came back inside, Gracie was sitting in the last booth with the bearded man from the Oregon chapter who'd made her laugh from the porch. He had a piece of apple pie in front of him, and Gracie was across from him with a glass of milk, and they were talking with the complete ease of two people who'd decided they liked each other, the 40-year age difference between them, registering as entirely irrelevant. The man's name, Olivia would learn, was Garrett, and he had 4 grandchildren in a workshop where he built wooden toys, and he and Gracie were apparently in the middle of a detailed technical conversation about whether rabbits or horses were faster over short distances. She stood in the doorway and watched them. She thought about the word family. She thought about how her whole life she'd understood it to mean people you were born to or people you married, and how those two definitions had served her so badly, the first through absence and the second through betrayal. And she thought about how she was standing in her father's diner, watching her daughter talk to a stranger from Oregon who had driven 4 hours that morning for someone he'd never met. And there was a word for what she was feeling, and it was the same word. The Billings Gazette reporter was still there, still writing. The evening service began to wind down. The riders who'd come from the furthest distances had started heading out in the mid-afternoon, and by 6 o'clock the count outside had dropped significantly, but there were still perhaps 300 people, and the work crews were still at it by lantern in work light on the exterior. The sounds didn't stop. She'd stopped expecting them to. At 7 o'clock, Linda sat her down and put a plate of food in front of her and stood with arms crossed in a posture that made it clear this was not negotiable. "Eat," Linda said. "We have it." "Linda, Marcus is doing the counter carols in the kitchen. I'm right here. Eat the food." She ate the food. She sat in her father's diner and she ate a meal she hadn't cooked, and she listened to the sounds of work being done on the building around her and the sound of her daughter laughing in the back booth, and the sounds from outside of people who had come from hundreds of miles because a story was true and truth had moved them, and she let herself feel all of it at once, which was something she very rarely let herself do. It was enormous. It was almost too much to be inside of. She thought, "Dad, you would have wanted to see this. You would have stood in this kitchen and you would have talked to every single person and you would have remembered all of their names. You were better at this than I am, but I'm here. I'm still here." Outside, someone started a motorcycle and then another, and the sound of it rolled through the evening air, and someone else joined in, and then more, not leaving just the sound of engines running for a moment, a low collective sound like breathing. Gracie came running out of the back booth and pressed her face to the window. "Mama," she said without turning around. "Mama, are you hearing this?" "I'm hearing it," Olivia said. "What does it mean?" Olivia thought about that. She thought about what a sound like that meant to a group of people who communicated partly in the language of engines, who had a grammar of the road that outsiders didn't speak. She thought about what Jack had said about people like you being rare. She thought about what it meant that a sound like that could be aimed at someone, that a room of motorcycles could make a sound like applause if that's what they decided to make it. I think, she said carefully, it means they're saying thank you. Gracie turned from the window. She looked at her mother with those clear, uncomplicated eyes that had looked at her that morning and said, "You look tired," with the same directness that her mother used, that her grandfather had used, that apparently ran in some unbroken line through the women of this family. "You should say you're welcome," Gracie said. Olivia walked to the front door of her father's diner. She opened it. She stood on the porch in the evening air, and the sound of the engines rose slightly when she appeared, and she raised one hand. Not a wave, something more quiet than a wave, more like acknowledgement, like I see you, like I know what you did, and she held it there for a moment while the sound held around her. Then she let her hand down. She went back inside. She picked up the coffee pot. She kept going. The Chicago crew arrived on a Wednesday morning in a white van with equipment cases stacked in the back, and a producer named Teresa Walsh, who had sharp eyes and the specific kind of calm that came from having covered enough difficult stories that very little rattled her anymore. Olivia met her at the door. Teresa Walsh shook her hand and looked at her and said, "I want to be straight with you before we start. I've covered a lot of human interest stories. Most of them have a version that's better than the reality. I don't think that's the case here, but I need you to know that I'll tell the truth of what I see, not the version anyone wants me to tell." Olivia looked at her. "That's exactly what I want you to do," she said. Teresa Walsh blinked. Just once quickly, the involuntary response of someone who'd expected a different answer. "All right," she said. "Then we'll get along fine." They got along fine. The camera crew. Two of them, a man named Phil who moved quietly and shot everything like he was trying not to disturb something alive, and a younger woman named Sue who handled sound and had an instinct for being in the right place before anything happened, set up without taking over the room, which Olivia had told Teresa was the condition. They worked around the diner and the work crew, the way water works around stones present and unobtrusive. And within an hour, Olivia had almost forgotten they were there. Almost. There was a moment around 9 in the morning when she was pouring coffee for a table of 4 regulars. Locals, people who came in every Wednesday, and she looked up and Phil had the camera pointed at her, and she felt the specific awareness of being observed, not uncomfortably, but consciously, the way you feel a shift in temperature. She thought about what Jack had said. True things deserve to be known. She looked back down at the coffee and kept pouring. Outside, Ronnie's crew was already at work on the second day's tasks. The electrical panel replacement had started before 7, and through the wall of the diner she could hear the sounds of it. Steady, purposeful, the sounds of people who knew what they were doing and were doing it without waste. The heating system was coming out in sections. The old one that had been limping along on reduced output for 2 winters, and she'd been told that by end of day today there would be a new one in its place. She was trying not to think about what that meant too directly, because she was afraid if she let herself feel it fully, she'd be useless for the rest of the morning. The first interview Teresa Walsh did was not with Olivia, it was with Linda. Linda sat at the counter with her coffee and she talked to Teresa the way Linda talked to everyone, plainly without performance, with the particular authority of a woman who had been paying attention for 63 years and had decided that honesty was less work than its alternative. She talked about Roy Whitmore, what kind of man he'd been, how this diner had been the kind of place where people stopped because they wanted to, not because it was convenient. She talked about the months after Roy died, watching Olivia hold it together. She said most people, when they're losing something they love, they go quiet. They stop fighting because fighting hurts more than just letting go. Olivia doesn't work that way. She's like her father. The harder it gets, the quieter and more stubborn she gets. I've been watching her for 2 years, and I have never once seen her feel sorry for herself in public. She paused. That night with the bikers, when she called me the next morning to tell me what she'd done, I'll be honest, my first thought was, God, Olivia. My second thought was that I should have expected exactly that from her, because that's who she is. That's who she was raised to be. Teresa let the silence sit after that, which was the mark of a good interviewer. And then she said, "Were you scared for her?" "Terrified," Linda said without hesitation. "But I've been terrified for her before. She's going to do what she thinks is right, and she's going to do it with full knowledge of the risk. You can't stop a person like that. You can only hope you're there to help with the aftermath. Olivia was behind the counter hearing all of this while she worked, and she kept her face neutral with some effort. At 10:30, Teresa Walsh came to find Olivia during a gap and said, "I want to talk to the man whose life you saved. Michael Reyes. Is he here?" "He's not," Olivia said. "He went back to Great Falls after he came to see me. I have his number. Would you be willing to call him and ask if he'd speak with us?" Olivia thought about it. "I'll ask him, but it's his choice." She called Michael from the back room. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been expecting the call or something like it. She explained Teresa Walsh and the Chicago crew and the segment, and she said, "You don't have to. I want you to know that before anything else." "I know," Michael said. "Jack told me it was coming." A pause. "What do you want me to do?" "I told you, it's your choice." "Olivia," his voice was calm, "you saved my life. If talking to a camera crew helps people understand what you did and why it matters, then that's easy. That's the easiest thing I'll do this week." She held the phone for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "Tell her I can be there by tomorrow morning." She told Teresa Walsh. Teresa's expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes shifted the recognition that the story was going to be what it appeared to be, which was something that didn't happen as often as it should. By noon, something else had happened that nobody had planned. The story had been running on the Gazette's website since that morning, the reporter from 2 days before having filed her piece overnight. Someone had shared it on a Facebook group for veterans. Someone else had shared it in a motorcycle enthusiast forum with 500,000 members. By the time Olivia became aware of this, the piece had been read 80,000 times, and the comment section had become something she couldn't read without having to stop and look away for a minute. Not because it was bad, but because it was too much of the opposite. Roy Benton came in at noon with a printout. He still printed things which Olivia found endearing of the comment section. He set it on the counter in front of her without saying anything. She read 3 comments and put it face down. "Too much," Roy said. "Too fast," she said. "I need to still be in the room when I'm in." "Fair enough," Roy said. He picked it back up. But then he stopped and he said, without looking at her, "There's one comment I want to read to you, just one of us." She looked at him. He found it on the page. He read, "I'm a single mother in Akron, Ohio. I work 2 jobs and I'm 6 months behind on my mortgage. I haven't told anyone because I don't want my kids to be scared. I read this story at 4 in the morning when I couldn't sleep and I cried for 20 minutes and then I got up and made breakfast. I'm going to be okay. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to be okay." Roy put the printout down. Olivia didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about that woman in Akron. She thought about 4 in the morning, which she knew precisely the specific quality of 4 in the morning, when you're alone and afraid, and the rest of the world is asleep, and everything hard feels permanent. She thought about what it meant that someone somewhere had read her story and gotten up and made breakfast. "Okay," she said, her voice was steady. "You can leave the printout." Roy left the printout. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and she carried it for the rest of the day. At 2 in the afternoon, Jack Morgan arrived. He came in without announcement the way he always did, and he sat at the counter and she poured him coffee and she said, "Teresa Walsh wants to talk to you." "I know," he said. "She called me this morning." "Are you going to?" "That depends on you," he said. "This is your story, Olivia, not mine." She looked at him. She'd been thinking about this. "It's not only mine," she said. "What your people did that's yours, that belongs to your people. They deserve to have it told right." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Outside, she could hear Ronnie's crew and the sound of the new heating system going in, and every time she heard that sound, something in her chest did something complicated. "There's something I want to say to you before I say it to a camera," he said. She leaned against the counter. "Say it." He looked down at the cup for a moment. Jack Morgan was not a man who prepared speeches or looked for the eloquent version of things. He said what he meant in the most direct way available to him, which was a quality she respected more than she could have explained. When he looked up, his eyes were steady, and the thing moving through them was something she hadn't seen there before, which was the look of a man saying something he's never said aloud. "I had a brother," he said. "Not a chapter brother, my actual brother. His name was Thomas. He was 24 years old and he was on his bike in November 15 years ago, and he went down on an icy road, And he got hurt, not badly, he could walk, but it was 22 degrees, and he was an hour from the nearest town, and he flagged 3 cars. He paused. 3 cars didn't stop. The diner was quiet around them. He died of exposure before the 4th car came, Jack said. He was 24 years old and he died because 3 people drove past him and decided whatever he wasn't worth stopping for. Olivia stood very still. I've been riding ever since with that, he said. Not with anger. I'm past anger. With the knowledge that one person stopping would have been all it took. One person deciding that a stranger in trouble was worth the inconvenience. He looked at her. You didn't just save Michael that night. You understand that, don't you? He stopped. He picked up the coffee cup and put it down. Every single person in that parking lot has a version of my brother in their history. Somebody who got left. Somebody the world drove past. And you, he stopped again. I opened a door, she said quietly. You stopped, he said. When everyone said don't, you stopped. She held his eyes. She thought about the light switch. She thought about how close it had been. She thought about the tune in the snow and the figure collapsing in her parking lot and the choice she'd made in a fraction of a second with $43 in her register and her daughter asleep in the back room. And she thought about Thomas Morgan, 24 years old in November, in the 4th car that came too late. I'm glad I stopped, she said. So am I, Jack said. He wiped his face once quickly with the back of his hand. Then he picked up his coffee. Tell Teresa Walsh I'll talk to her. She nodded. She pushed off the counter and went back to work. She had 4 tables to check and a pie in the oven, and she could hear Marcus calling from the kitchen that they were getting low on the burger patties, and life had the quality it always had of not pausing for the significant moments, just moving through them and past them and forward regardless. She paused at the end of the counter, and she said without turning around, Jack, Thomas would have liked this place. A silence behind her. Yes, Jack said, he would have. She went to check her tables. Michael Rice's arrived the next morning at 8 earlier than he'd said, which she'd half expected because he seemed like the kind of person who was always slightly earlier than he said he'd be. He walked in, and the room noticed him the way it had started to notice everyone connected to the story with a slightly different quality of attention. The awareness that these were the people, the actual people, not a recounting, and he sat at the counter and she gave him coffee, and they talked for a few minutes before Teresa Walsh appeared, the producer's instinct for timing apparently calibrated to perfection. The interview with Michael was not long. Teresa was good at her job, which meant she asked the shortest possible version of each question and then got out of the way. Michael answered with the same directness she'd noticed in him from the first night, no drama, no embellishment, just the facts as he'd lived them, which were dramatic enough without any of that. He talked about the bike going down and the cold that came on faster than he'd expected. The way it moved from discomfort to something more serious in a span of time that shocked him, even in retrospect. He talked about trying to stay moving and not being able to. He talked about the point where he'd stopped being scared because the fear requires a certain level of energy that he no longer had. And then, Teresa said, and then there were lights, Michael said, and voices. And I remember being lifted, which hurt. And I remember light that wasn't headlights, warmer light, and I remember warmth and a voice saying, don't sleep, don't sleep, don't sleep. He paused, and I woke up in a diner booth with 3 tablecloths on top of me and a woman telling me to drink slowly. What was your first clear thought? Teresa said. Michael was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup. I thought she's not afraid of me. And that was it. Sounds small, but it wasn't small. You get used to a certain version of how people look at you. You get used to the thing that happens when people see the jacket and make the calculation. She didn't make that calculation. She saw a person who needed help and she helped. That's the whole thing. That's everything. Teresa was good enough not to follow that with another question. Phil, the cameraman, had shifted slightly, and Olivia, watching from behind the counter, caught the way the lens had moved from Michael to her, and she looked away. She didn't want to perform this. She picked up a rag and wiped the counter she'd already wiped. Teresa turned to her eventually. She said, I want to ask you something that I don't want you to answer unless the true answer is something you want to say. All right, Olivia said. Were you scared when you opened the door? Olivia thought about it. She thought about being honest. She thought about the woman in Akron reading her story at 4 in the morning. She thought about the single mothers in the places she'd never been, who were going to see this segment sometime between 6 and 9 in the morning with their coffee going cold beside them. Yes, she said. I was terrified. I had my daughter asleep 20 feet away, and I had a room full of strangers who matched every warning I'd ever been given, and my hand was on the light switch. She paused. But I was more afraid of being the person who let someone die in the snow because they made me nervous. That scared me more. Teresa said, why? Because that's a person you don't get to come back from, Olivia said. I've had to come back from a lot of things. I didn't want to have to come back from that. The room was very quiet. Phil was very still behind the camera. Then Gracie's voice came from the back room. Mama, can I have the cereal without raisins? And the room exhaled. Someone at a table laughed. Michael Reyes put his head down and his shoulders moved, and when he looked up, he was smiling with his whole face. Teresa Walsh pressed her lips together in the way of a person preventing a smile from taking over entirely. Yes, Olivia called back. The one in the low cabinet. I know which one. Then why are you asking? I just wanted to make sure you remembered which one was mine. Olivia looked at Teresa Walsh. Teresa looked at her. Phil, the cameraman, had swiveled the lens toward the backroom hallway. You can leave that in, Olivia said. Wouldn't dream of cutting it, Teresa said. The afternoon brought two things Olivia hadn't anticipated, which was becoming a pattern she was learning to expect. Nothing about this story arrived in the order or form she predicted it would. The first was Danny. He called her cell phone at 2:17 in the afternoon on the third day of filming. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered because she always answered numbers she didn't recognize, because her policy was that the call she ignored was always the one that mattered. His voice came through the same as she remembered it, a particular register that used to mean home, and now meant something she didn't have a clean word for. Olivia, he said. She walked into the back room and closed the door. Danny, I saw the thing online, he said, about the diner. She didn't say anything. I'm glad things are turning around, he said. It came out the way things come out when someone has practiced them and they still don't land right. Okay, she said, I wanted to say, he stopped. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I left, for the debts. I've been, Danny. Her voice was even, not cold, not warm, just level. I don't have time for this right now. I'm in the middle of something. I know, I can see that. I know what you wanted, she said, and I want you to hear this clearly. What's happening here has nothing to do with you. It happened because my father built something worth fighting for, and I chose to keep fighting for it. The people in this town and the people in that parking lot, that's not connected to you in any way. Silence. Gracie's good, she said. She's healthy and she's happy and she's fine. I'll let her know you called when she's older, and it's her choice whether to call you back. She paused. Take care of yourself, Danny. She hung up. She stood in the back room for 30 seconds. She breathed in and out. She thought about how she'd expected that call to feel like something huge, the way you dread things for months, and then they arrive and they're smaller than the dread. Danny calling was not the thing she'd feared. It was just a phone call from a man she used to know asking for something she didn't have to give. She went back out to the counter. Linda was looking at her. Linda always knew. You okay? Linda said. Yep, Olivia said. Linda handed her the coffee pot. Pete wants a refill. On it, Olivia said. The second thing she hadn't anticipated was Ronnie, who found her at 4 o'clock and said, come see. She followed him to the back of the building. He'd been back there with 2 of his crew for an hour, and she hadn't thought much of it. What she found was that the back storage room, a space she'd been using to pile the things that didn't have anywhere better to go, the overflow inventory, the broken equipment she hadn't thrown out because throwing things out cost money she didn't have, had been cleaned out and reorganized, and one wall had been reinforced and fitted with proper industrial shelving, and in the middle of the room there was a work table she'd never seen before, solid wood, clearly handmade, clearly new. She looked at Ronnie. We had material left over, he said. You built a table, she said. It's a good work surface. You needed a proper prep station back here. He said it practically the way you say practical things. She looked at the table. She put her hand on it. It was solid in the way that handmade things are solid, built with attention rather than speed, and it smelled of new wood and something like care. Ronnie, she said. Don't, he said, not unkindly. The way men who are uncomfortable with gratitude headed off not to be rude but to keep their footing. Thank you, she said anyway, because he'd earned it. He waved a hand and went back to his work. She stood in the reorganized back room with her hand on the new table, and she understood something that she'd been approaching from different angles for 3 days without quite arriving at. What was happening here wasn't charity. She'd been calling it that in her mind, the way you call things the closest available word, but it wasn't right. Charity was something given by people who had more to people who had less, with a distance built into the transaction. What was happening here was something else. It was people who had also lost things, who had also been looked past, who had also been told they were less than they were deciding that the woman who had refused to look past them was one of theirs. It was a community deciding to include someone. It was the thing human beings do when they are at their most human, which is recognize another person completely. She'd done it for them. They were doing it for her. That was the whole transaction. That was all of it. She went back to the counter. The diner was filling for the dinner service, and Marcus had the tables, and Carol had the kitchen, and Linda had the counter. And there was, for the first time in 2 years, something that felt almost like the way the diner had felt when her father ran it. When there were enough hands and enough warmth, and the work was hard, but not impossible the way work should be. Phil was in the corner with the camera. Olivia had mostly stopped registering it. At 6 o'clock, Gracie appeared at the end of the counter and climbed up on her stool and set her rabbit beside the napkin holder and said, "Can Garrett come for dinner tonight?" Olivia looked at her. "Garrett from Oregon." "He's still here," Gracie said. "He stayed to help Ronnie with the shelving." Olivia looked at Linda. Linda was looking at the ceiling with an expression of elaborate neutrality. "Call him in," Olivia said. Garrett from Oregon came in and sat across from Gracie in the back booth, and they continued whatever conversation they'd been having for 3 days, and Olivia brought them both plates without being asked, and she stood for a moment watching her daughter explain something with both hands to a large bearded man from Oregon who was listening with his full and complete attention, and she thought about what Gracie would remember of this, what stayed in the body and the memory from age 6. She thought about her own memories of watching her father, not the big things, but the small ones. The specific way he'd handed someone their coffee, the way he'd stopped what he was doing to listen, the way he'd turned the truck around. She hoped Gracie would remember this. She believed she would. Teresa Walsh found her at 7 near the end of the dinner service, and she said, "I want to do one final thing before we head out tomorrow. I want you to stand in the room and just talk. Not an interview, not questions. Just tell me in your own words what the last 2 weeks have been." Olivia looked at her. "That sounds like an interview." "It sounds like one," Teresa agreed, "but it isn't. An interview is me asking things. This is just you saying the true thing." They stood near the counter. Phil was there with the camera quiet as he'd been for 3 days present without pressure. The dinner crowd was thinning. Linda was wiping down the far end of the counter. Garrett and Gracie were still in their booth. Olivia looked at the room. She looked at the clock her father had hung in 1993 that still kept perfect time. She looked at the corkboard where the bank letter had been and where it wasn't anymore because she'd taken it down when the foreclosure was halted, and she'd held it over the trash can for a moment before folding it and putting it in the drawer where she kept the things she needed to remember. "I spent 2 years thinking this place was mine to save," she said. "Like it was my problem and my responsibility and my fight and nobody else's. And I was wrong about that. Not wrong to fight for it. My father built it and it deserved to be fought for. But wrong that it was mine alone." She paused. "What I've learned in the last 2 weeks is that the things worth saving are never just yours. They belong to everyone who's ever felt something real inside them. My father understood that. I'm just getting there." She stopped. Teresa was quiet. "One night I opened a door because a man fell down in the snow," Olivia said. "And everything else came from that. All of it. I didn't plan it. I didn't calculate it. I just decided in 1 second that a stranger in trouble was worth more than my fear." She looked at Phil's camera steadily, not performing, but not flinching either. "I think most people would make the same choice. I think most people are better than the fear. They just need a second where they have to choose." The room was quiet. Then Gracie's voice from the back booth, "Garrett, you're wrong. Rabbits are definitely faster for short distances." Garrett's voice patient and amused, "I'll concede the short distances." "Thank you," Gracie said with the specific satisfaction of a 6-year-old who has won a 3-day argument. Teresa Walsh looked at Olivia. That's your ending, Teresa said. That's my daughter, Olivia said. Same thing, Teresa said. She wasn't wrong. That night, after the diner closed and the crew had packed their equipment, and Ronnie had finished the last of the heating installation and signed off on it with a handshake that meant more than any paperwork. And after Gracie had fallen asleep in the back room with her rabbit under one arm, and inexplicably a small wooden horse that Garrett had produced from his jacket pocket at some point during dinner. After all of that, Olivia sat alone at the counter. The diner was quiet. The new heating system was running, and the particular quality of that warmth was different from before. Even more steady, the warmth of a building that had been properly taken care of. She noticed it in her body before she noticed it consciously, the absence of the draft that used to come through the north wall, the absence of the specific cold spot near the back booth that she'd been putting extra tablecloths on for 2 winters. She put both hands flat on the counter. She thought about the $43. She thought about Thomas Morgan, 24 years old, November 3. Cars that didn't stop. She thought about the woman in Akron reading at 4 in the morning and getting up to make breakfast. She thought about her father, quiet in March, present every summer. She thought about Gracie's face at the window when the motorcycles came wide-eyed and wondering, not afraid. She sat there in the warm, repaired, still diner, and she let it be real. The whole thing, all at once. She didn't compartmentalize it or push through it or keep her hands busy to avoid it. She just sat in it. It was enormous. It was true. It was hers. Outside on the highway, a single motorcycle passed, heading north, its headlight cutting through the dark and then gone. She watched it go the way she'd watched things go her whole life from behind this counter, weather and trucks and seasons and customers and time. And she thought about what came next, which she didn't know, which she'd never known, which had turned out to be the part that saved her every time. She got up. She turned off the lights. She went to check on her daughter. The segment aired on a Thursday morning at 7:42 Central Time, which meant it was 6:42 in Red Valley, and Olivia was already behind the counter with the coffee going, and Pete Larson in his usual spot with his eggs ordered, and Linda sitting 2 stools down with her hands around a mug, both of them pretending they weren't watching the small television that Olivia had mounted on the wall behind the pie case 6 days ago specifically for this morning. She'd told herself she wasn't going to watch it live. She watched it live. The segment was 4 minutes and 18 seconds. She knew this because it felt both much longer and much shorter than 4 minutes and 18 seconds, the way significant things always occupy more psychological time than clock time. Teresa Walsh's voiceover was steady and clear and used exactly the words Olivia would have chosen if she'd been the one writing it, which she hadn't been, and which she'd been nervous about. There was footage of the diner from outside, the repaired roofline catching the morning light. There was Jack Morgan talking about Tom, which he'd agreed to, and which hit her the same way it had hit her the first time she heard it, like something solid dropping into still water. There was Michael saying she saw a person who needed help, and she helped. There was Gracie's voice from off camera, not planned, not staged, saying, "Mama, can I have the cereal without raisins?" And the laugh that moved through the segment's audio at that moment was real because it had been real. It had been the actual room laughing, and that realness came through the screen and into every living room in the country where someone was watching. And then there was Olivia. She watched herself say the thing about the second where you have to choose, and she watched herself not look away from the camera, and she thought, that's true. That's exactly what I said and exactly what I meant, and it's strange to watch yourself mean something. When it ended, Pete Larson said without looking up from his eggs, "Good piece. Thank you, Pete." "Your father would have thought it was too much fuss," he said. "He would have," she agreed. "But he would have been proud." She didn't answer that. She turned back to the counter and she kept her face down for a moment because Pete was right, and it went straight through her and she needed a second before she could be in the room normally again. Linda said nothing. Linda just refilled her own coffee from the pot on the counter, which she wasn't supposed to do from the customer side, and she did it with the air of a woman who had decided that some mornings the rules were beside the point. The phone started ringing at 7:51. The first call was from a woman in Denver who said she'd watched the segment while getting her kids ready for school and that she needed Olivia to know it had mattered to her personally. She didn't explain why. She just said it mattered, and she said thank you, and she hung up. Olivia stood holding the phone for a moment after she did, then set it back in the cradle and went back to the counter. The second call was from a man who said he rode with a chapter in Kentucky and that his chapter had been talking about the story for 2 weeks, and they wanted to stop in the next time they were doing a run through Montana. The third call was from a journalist in New York who wanted an exclusive. The fourth call was from Gerald House at the bank, who said he'd seen the segment and who said, with the careful phrasing of a man who had learned something about himself that he was still processing, "I want you to know that your account is in good standing and that we consider this matter fully resolved, and that if there is ever anything this institution can do to support Whitmore's Diner going forward, we would consider it an honor." He paused. "Your father was a good customer for a long time, Olivia. I should have remembered that better." She held the phone. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it in the complicated way that people mean things when they're apologizing without quite saying the word. By 9 o'clock, the calls had become continuous enough that she asked Marcus to answer the phone and take names and numbers, and Marcus did this with a seriousness that made her realize he was 17 and had been showing up every day for 2 weeks without being asked and without complaint, and that she needed to properly pay him, which she would as soon as she worked out what properly meant relative to her current financial state. By 10 o'clock, she'd gotten an email. Roy Benton had set her up with an email address for the diner 2 days before the segment aired, because Roy had quietly decided to become useful in a way that suited his particular skill set, which was anticipating what was needed before it was needed from a woman named Barbara Chen, who was a literary agent in New York and who said she represented a number of narrative nonfiction authors, and that she believed Olivia's story had the shape of a book, and that if Olivia was ever interested in discussing this, she should call the number at the bottom of the email. Olivia read the email twice. Then she forwarded it to Roy Benton's email address with the message, "Do you know what to do with this?" Roy replied 11 minutes later. "I have some ideas. Let me make a call." She had no idea what call Roy was going to make or to whom. She put her phone in her apron pocket and went back to work. The diner was full for lunch in a way it had not been full for lunch in 2 years, which was to say all the tables were occupied and there were 3 people waiting near the door, and 2 of them were strangers who'd driven up from Billings specifically because they'd seen the segment and wanted to eat at Whitmore's, which was a sentence Olivia turned over in her mind while she was cooking and couldn't fully make sense of, but decided to simply accept the way you accept weather. Curtis showed up at noon. He just walked in the same as the first night, with the same ease of someone who knew he was welcome without needing it confirmed. He sat at the counter and he looked around the full diner and he said, "You need help." "I always need help," she said. "I'm here for 2 days," he said. "Point at me at something." She pointed him at the kitchen. He tied on an apron. She had a spare. She had started keeping a spare. And he went into the kitchen and he worked beside Carol with the efficiency of someone who'd spent time in a commercial kitchen at some point in his life, though he didn't explain when or where, and she didn't ask because the kitchen was not the place for biography. At 1:30, when the lunch rush had peaked and was beginning to settle, Olivia came out of the kitchen and found Jack Morgan sitting at the counter. She stopped. He looked at her. He looked different from every other time she'd seen him. Not physically. Same jacket, same weathered face, same gray in the beard. Different in the way a man looks when he's carrying something he's decided to put down. She poured him coffee without saying anything, and she leaned against the counter across from him, and she waited. "I watched the segment this morning," he said. "Me too," she said. "You said something," he said, "about people being better than the fear, that they just need a second where they have to choose." "I meant it," she said. "I know you did." He turned the cup. "I've been thinking about Thomas since I told you about him. I don't talk about him. I haven't talked about him in probably 8 years. Not to anyone in the chapter, not to—" He stopped. "It's the kind of thing that becomes easier to carry in silence than to put into words, because words make it real in a way that silence doesn't." She listened. "But I told you," he said, "and it was real anyway, and it didn't break anything. It was just real." He looked up at her. "I don't know what that means about you specifically, but it means something." "It means you were ready," she said. "Not because of me. You were ready, and I happened to be there." He shook his head slightly. "You don't take credit well." "I take the right amount," she said. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "The segment's going to change things for you," he said. "I mean, more than what's already changed, you know that." "I'm figuring that out," she said. "The calls, the emails, there's going to be more. People are going to want things from you. your story, your time, your name on things. He said it not as a warning exactly, more as information from someone who had watched what happened when a story got large. You don't owe anyone anything beyond what you want to give. I know that, she said. I'm saying it anyway. I know that too, she said, and I appreciate it. He drank his coffee. Around them, the diner moved through its early afternoon rhythm. A few tables still occupied the sound of Curtis and Carol in the kitchen, Marcus wiping down the tables that had turned over. The clock above the pie case said 1:47. I want to ask you something, Olivia said, and I want you to tell me the true answer. All right, he said. What do you need, she said. Not what did you want to give, not what does the chapter want to do. What do you need from this, from what happened? He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen sounds continued. Someone's silverware clinked against a plate. To know it wasn't wasted, he said finally. What happened to Thomas? I've been writing for 15 years, and part of what I was doing without saying it, even to myself, was making sure that the way he died, the being left the being, looked past. I was making sure that wasn't what the world was, that it wasn't the truth of people. He paused. You showed me it isn't, not just by saving Michael, by being who you are, by standing there and he stopped. It wasn't wasted, his death. My 15 years, none of it was wasted. That's what I needed. She held his eyes. It wasn't wasted, she said. He nodded once. They sat in the quiet of the early afternoon, and neither of them needed to say anything else. And that silence was its own kind of fullness, the kind that only exists between people who have told each other true things. The twist that no one saw coming. Not Olivia, not Jack, not Linda, or Roy Benton, or Michael Reyes, or any of the people who'd been part of this story from the beginning, arrived 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in the form of a phone call from Barbara Chen, the literary agent Roy had forwarded the email to. Barbara Chen was sharp and direct and had a New York pace that Olivia registered as efficient rather than rude. She said she'd spoken with Roy, who she described as thorough, and that she'd done some research and that she had a proposal she wanted Olivia to consider. She described it the way she'd probably described 100 proposals quickly, clearly, with all the key terms up front, and Olivia stood behind her counter with the phone to her ear and listened to the outline of what Barbara Chen was proposing. It wasn't a book deal, not yet. It was a partnership with a nonprofit organization that worked with single parents in financial crisis. The kind of structural systemic crisis that Olivia had been inside of the second mortgages and the predatory loans and the bank letters and the 60-day windows, and they wanted to use Whitmore's story told in Olivia's voice as the foundation of a public awareness campaign. A book could come from that. A speaking platform could come from that. The diner itself, Barbara said, could become something more than a diner. It could become a symbol. I don't want to be a symbol, Olivia said. No, Barbara said without missing a beat. You want to be a diner owner who's financially stable and able to take care of her daughter. The symbol part is the mechanism, not the goal. Let it be the mechanism. Olivia was quiet for a moment. Who's the nonprofit? She said. Barbara named it. Olivia had never heard of it. She asked for the website and wrote it down on the back of an order ticket. I need time, Olivia said. Of course, Barbara said, but not too much time. The story is at its largest right now. That's the window. I understand that, Olivia said. I'll call you by Friday. She called Jack first. She found his number in her phone. He'd given it to her the morning the chapter left, pressing it into her hand in the particular way of someone making sure a thing is done right. And she called him, and he picked up on the third ring, and she told him what Barbara Chen had proposed, all of it, keeping her voice even and factual the way she did when she was thinking something through rather than feeling it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What's your instinct? He said. My instinct is that it's real, she said. I've been lied to by a person who was supposed to love me. I know what lying sounds like. She wasn't lying. Then that's your answer, he said. It's not that simple. No, he agreed, but the instinct is right and you know it, and you're calling me because you want someone to confirm what you already know. So I'm confirming it. Do the thing. She almost laughed. That's your advice. That's my advice, he said. You've been doing the thing every day for 2 years. You know how. She called Barbara Chen on Thursday a day early. She said yes. What followed was not simple and was not fast and was not the clean resolution that stories in their telling sometimes make things seem. There were lawyers because Barbara insisted and Roy concurred, and the lawyer Roy found was a woman named Patricia Greer, who charged a fair rate and who read everything twice and who told Olivia plainly and without softening it where the risks were and what questions to ask. There were conversations with the nonprofit that were sometimes encouraging and sometimes frustrating and always real the reality of institutional processes that moved at their own pace, regardless of anyone's sense of urgency. There were days that were just regular days which nobody talks about in the afterpart of a story like this. Days when the diner was slow and the weather was bad and Gracie had a cold and was cranky and Olivia was tired in the way that sleep doesn't entirely fix. Days when the check Jack's chapter had given her sat in her bank account and felt both like a lifeline and like a responsibility so large she had to not look at it directly. Days when she woke up at 4 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought about everything that could still go wrong, because 4 in the morning doesn't care what the news segment said about you. But then there were the other days. Michael came back in December, 3 months after the storm. He came alone this time, no chapter business, just him and his bike, and a clear winter afternoon. He sat at the counter, and they talked for 2 hours, and he showed her a picture of his mother, who'd seen the segment in El Paso where she lived, and who had called him 17 times in a single day, and Michael had answered every call. I finally picked up on the 18th, he said. The 18th. She left a voicemail that made me feel terrible, he said. She said, Michael, I'm your mother. I just want to know you're alive. He looked at his coffee. We talked for 2 hours. I hadn't talked to her like that in 4 years. 4 years. Olivia leaned on the counter. What happened 4 years ago? Bad stuff, he said. The kind that makes you go quiet. The kind that makes you think if you don't say anything, the distance protects you. Does it? No, he said. It just makes the distance. He looked up. She's coming up in February to visit. Good, Olivia said. Yeah, Michael said, and the word came out differently than his usual direct delivery. It came out like something released. Yeah, it's good. She'd been thinking a lot about connection, about the specific way people had arrived in her life over the last 3 months and what they brought and what they changed and what stayed after they went. Curtis, who had worked 2 days in her kitchen and left knowing more about her than most people who'd known her for years, because a kitchen made people honest. Ronnie, who had built her a table and waved off her gratitude, and who she'd gotten a Christmas card from in December, handwritten. 3 sentences, the return address, a town in Idaho she'd never been to. Deb from Spokane, who'd called twice, not about anything in particular, just to check in, which Deb delivered, as checking in on the diner. How's the traffic? How's the new heater? But which Olivia understood was actually Deb checking in on her, the way women check in on each other when they recognize something in common. Garrett from Oregon had sent Gracie 2 more wooden animals in the mail, a bear and a fox. Gracie had them arranged on the windowsill of the back room in a specific order that apparently held narrative significance, though Gracie had declined to fully explain the narrative, saying only that it was complicated. The morning show segment had, as Teresa Walsh predicted, changed things in ways that were still unfolding. The diner's lunch service was full almost every day now. A food writer from a magazine in Minneapolis had stopped in November and written a small piece about the pie, specifically the blueberry, which Linda had been insufferably pleased about because she'd been the one to source those blueberries from a farm 40 miles north every summer for years, and had always said they were the real reason the pie was what it was. The article was modest and accurate, and it drove exactly the kind of traffic that a diner needed: people who genuinely wanted to come and eat, not people who came to look at something they'd seen on television and left without ordering enough to justify the table. Roy Benton had put together a small local business coalition. He'd been quiet about it, which was his style, building things, while they were still small enough to build without interference, and the coalition had taken on 2 other struggling businesses in Red Valley with the same patient structural approach that Roy had used to work Gerald Haas's message through to Olivia. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a news segment. It was Roy doing what Roy did, which was identify problems early and solve them with the tools available. And the tool he'd found he had available was the credibility of Olivia's story and the goodwill it had generated toward the town. She'd told him once that she didn't want to be a symbol. You're not a symbol, Roy said. You're a proof of concept. She wasn't sure that was better, but she let it go. The first anniversary arrived faster than she expected, the way the anniversaries of significant things always do, arriving before you finish processing the thing itself. She knew it was coming. Jack had called in October to say that some members of the chapter wanted to come back on the anniversary weekend, not in the numbers of the second time that had been a specific moment, he said, and you didn't try to recreate specific moments. That was how you ruined them, but a group, 30, maybe 40 people, just to come back to the place where the thing had happened and be in it for a day. Is that all right? He asked. He always asked. She'd noticed that about him from the beginning, the care he took to ask. It's more than all right, she said. I'll make sure people know to order the blueberry pie, he said. The article took care of that, she said. I saw the article, he said. Linda's going to be impossible about that. She already is, Olivia said. He was quiet for a moment in the comfortable way they'd gotten used to the silences that didn't need to be filled. And then he said, Olivia, are you good? Olivia, are... She thought about the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. She thought about the nonprofit partnership, which was moving slowly but moving. She thought about Patricia Greer and the contract they had finally signed and what it meant for the next 2 years. She thought about Gracie, who was 7 now, and who had started second grade in September, and who had told her teacher on the first day that her mom ran a famous diner, which her teacher had looked up and confirmed, and which had given Gracie a social standing among 7-year-olds that Olivia found both amusing and faintly alarming. She thought about waking up that morning and walking into the diner and turning on the lights the way she did every morning, and the way the light came on without her having to hold her breath and pray the electrical was holding, because the electrical had been replaced by 2 licensed electricians in October and was not going anywhere. She thought about the heater running steadily through the November cold without the draft from the north wall, without the particular chill that used to settle into the back booth by 7 in the evening. She thought about the table Ronnie had built in the back room, which she used every day, and the way she put her hands on it every morning, the same way she'd put her hands on it the first day, feeling the solid reality of something made with care. She thought about $43. She thought about how far that was from where she was standing. Yeah, she said, I'm good. I'm really good. Good, Jack said. And in the single word, she heard the 15 years and Thomas and the 3 cars and the 4th car and everything that had carried him from that November to this one. The anniversary weekend came on a Saturday, the night before Olivia stayed late to prep the way she always did before a big day, and she was alone in the kitchen doing it, and she put on the radio low, and she moved through the familiar work with the ease that came from having done it 10,000 times, the specific grace of a person who knows exactly where they are. At one point she stopped. She stood in the middle of her kitchen. She thought about the night a year ago, the sound she'd heard, the headlights in the snow, the hand on the light switch. She thought about how everything that had happened, all of it, every piece had turned on 1 second. One moment where she'd had to choose. She'd chosen. And the choosing had changed everything. Not because the universe rewarded good people. She didn't believe it worked that way. And the evidence of her own life before that night had made a pretty solid argument against it. Not because some cosmic accounting had finally balanced in her favor, but because what you chose in the hardest second told the truth about who you were, and when people saw the truth of who you were, the ones worth knowing came toward it. She'd shown them who she was. They'd shown her who they were. That was the whole story. The next morning, she opened the diner at 5:30, the same as every morning. Pete Larson came in at 6 for his eggs. Linda came in at 6:15 with a muffin she said she'd made at home, which Olivia put on the counter, and they both agreed it was slightly too dry, which Linda attributed to the altitude, and Olivia attributed to the amount of flour. Marcus came in at 7 and put on his apron without being asked, which he'd been doing for 3 months and which still made her think about what she was paying him and whether it was enough. At 8:30, the first bikes pulled into the parking lot. Not the thundering approach of a year ago, not the 40 minutes of continuous sound. A smaller arrival measured the way people come back to a place they know rather than the way they arrive at one they don't. She heard them through the wall and she felt something in her chest that wasn't quite the same as anything she had a precise word for. She came out of the kitchen. She walked to the front door. She opened it. Jack Morgan was in the parking lot coming toward the porch, and when he saw her in the doorway, he stopped. He looked at her for a moment, the same look he'd given her a year ago, the one that was trying to understand what it was seeing, except that a year later, there was something in it that was not trying anymore, that had arrived at its understanding and was simply confirming it. Behind him, riders were coming off their bikes in 2s and 3s, and she could hear voices and laughter, and the sound of a group of people who knew each other well arriving somewhere they wanted to be. She could see Michael Reyes off to the left talking to someone she didn't recognize. She could see Curtis. She could see Deb from Spokane, who had driven 4 hours again, who would always drive 4 hours. Olivia was beginning to understand because that was the kind of person Deb was. And you didn't fight the people who showed up. You just made sure the coffee was ready. From behind her, she heard Gracie's voice. "Are they here, Mama? Are they here?" "They're here," Olivia called back. Gracie came flying through the diner. She could hear the small feet on the tile and arrived at Olivia's side at the door, rabbit in hand hair, still not brushed, and she looked out at the parking lot with those wide, clear eyes. "There's Garrett," she said, immediately spotting him somewhere in the crowd with the radar of a child who had been waiting. "Go say hi," Olivia said. Gracie went down the porch steps at speed. Olivia watched her daughter run across the parking lot toward a large bearded man from Oregon, who opened his arms when he saw her coming, and she let herself feel all of it, the whole weight and warmth of it, without pulling back from it. Then she looked at Jack. He was still standing where he'd stopped watching her. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee's ready," she said. "Blueberry pie's in the oven." "Then we're right on time," he said. He came up the porch steps and she stepped back and he came through the door. And then the others followed the way they'd followed a year ago through a storm, except that this time there was no storm. This time there was a clear Montana morning and a diner with a new roof and a new heating system and a woman standing at the door who wasn't afraid, who knew exactly who she was and who her people were and what this place was worth. Behind the counter, the coffee was ready. The pie was in the oven, the door was open, and Olivia Whitmore, who had almost let fear make her someone she wasn't, stood in her father's diner on the anniversary of the night that changed everything, surrounded by the people who had come back to remind her of the truth she already knew. That the bravest thing she had ever done took less than 1 second, and the life it built would last the rest of her days.